Hi, everyone. My name is Sarah Branch. I'm one of the archaeologists at Broadbent and Associates here in Reno. So I'm going to be talking to you guys a little bit about historic cans. Um, so this topic is, I've done done this talk a couple times in various iterations. And if anybody saw it at GBAC, they will know that kind of like a good buffet, this talk has kind of grown, and I tend to kind of put too much on my plate. So while I have titled it that we'll talk about making practical chronologies for Towle's log cabin syrup cans and other historic pantry staples, oops, my slides don't want to go. There we go. We're mostly going to be talking about log cabin syrup and MJB coffee. But there are some other little topics and surprises in here. So for a lot of us Great Basin archaeologists, we are very familiar with can scatters. They're fairly ubiquitous and sometimes a little daunting, especially with, there's very rarely labels. There's just masses and masses, and it's sometimes hard to figure out how we might make sense of them. And in fact, it was recording can scatters when I was a baby archaeologist that kind of cemented in my mind that I wanted to be a prehistoric archaeologist. But clearly I have seen the beauty in cans, mostly because when they first came out, they were a lot more colorful and there was a lot more information. And sometimes when we're lucky, we can still use that information to help us date our archaeological sites and figure out when exactly it was that, when in time, when through the years people were eating at these sites. So we'll jump right in with log cabin syrup cans. In 1897, James W. Fuller, who was a salesman for Towle's log cabin syrup company, patented a design for a can. And the patent is pretty familiar for anybody that's seen a log cabin can. You've got some pretty distinctive features here that can help us identify these early cans. Specifically, there's a handle on the top. Clearly, it's shaped like a log cabin. The spout for the syrup to come out is kind of placed where a chimney might be. And you can see on this illustration that the seams were lapped. So instead of kind of the more modern seams, it's very, very, very common for that time period for it to be a lap seam can. And sure enough, there are still examples of those original cans. Sometimes the handles are a little bit different, but you can see that they had a paper label. They have those lap seams, the little chimney spout, but all of the features are there. And so along with kind of doing this patent for the can, Towle's log cabin went full on with their advertising. So in 1904, they attended the Retail Grocers Association and had an entire display showing off all of the different sizes of cans, everything from the larger, more industrial sizes down to the tiny cans that theoretically would be, easy to leave on your table. They also went absolutely full into print advertising. And so you see this example from 1904, where you have this young girl clearly enjoying syrup straight from the cabin. But there's also, doing things like souvenir spoons, which there are a lot of examples still floating around. And that's, of course, something that J.W. Fuller patented as well. But the advertisements are pretty distinct, and they tell us a lot about kind of the features that were on the cans, what the cans look like, and just how serious they were about getting this to a national market. So one of the points, one of the reasons that I wanted to do this chronology is it's great to see these cans in, online pictures or in museums, but I wanted to try to identify what are the features that of these cans that we might see as archaeologists and might be able to use in a practical way. And so that's kind of what I'm sharing today. So from 1897 to about 1904, we have the log cabin cans are really similar to what that original patent has. And so you have that loop handle, the lap seams that are soldered, there's a threaded cap, a paper label, and the main body seam is on the bottom of the can. So here it's on the left-hand side, opposite from the ruler. So these are all really distinctive features that you can identify even when the can doesn't look so great in the archaeological context. And so this is a can that I recorded several years ago. And as you can see, you have that loop handle on the roof. You have the lap side seams. It's kind of hard to see from this photo, but the seam is along that bottom edge and not in the middle. And there's a threaded chimney spout. So this is one of those pre-1904 cans. There were a couple changes that got made between 1905 and 1907. The main thing being that the spout changed. It was no longer a threaded cap, and instead it was an external friction cap. And something else I'll mention again later, you can also see on the label that it was guaranteed under the Food and Drugs Act, June 30th, 1906. There's some interesting things that happened kind of prior to 1906 that makes this kind of an interesting addition to the can. But again, same paper label, looks very similar to those earliest cans. In 1907, it shifts again, mostly that we lose the handle. Everything else is pretty much the same. You still have that paper label, you still have a pry-off lid of some sort, you still have the seam on the edge of the can. And as you can see, sometimes these cans with the paper labels are definitely very collectible, and not, if you see one of these at a garage sale, absolutely pick it up because they've become quite valuable. One of the other weird things that happens in this time period, though, is that sometimes there's a handle on the side, even though there's no handle on the top of the can. Advertisements show, this is a 1910 advertisement, and you can see this woman cooking and she's holding the can by the side. And this advertisement clearly shows that as well. And so that's something that when I first gave this talk a year ago, I was very surprised. I hadn't even really noticed. But then several months later, one of our field crews from Broadbent was out in Ely and found a large log cabin can with the lap seams and the seam along the edge and a handle on the side of the body. And not just this really great example, but also one that's a little crushed. But again, you can still see there's the handle on the side of the cabin and not the top. Still has the lap seams, still has the body seam along the bottom edge of the cabin. So we know pretty well that that's that 1910 to 1911. That's about the only time we see those in the advertising. So around 1917, the can changes again. The company files another patent. And as you can see, it's for a much more illustrated can. And one of the other switches that happens at this time period is the label, instead of being paper, is actually printed. It's an actual lithographed label printed directly on the can. Clearly, the labeling is a lot more elaborate, but we also shift to rolled seams. And also importantly, the seam moves to the middle of the can. So this is one of those key things, even in the most rusted crushed cans, if you can find the bottom of the cabin and see where the seam is, you automatically know if you're looking at something before 1917 or after 1917. So another change that happens kind of in this time period, pre-1940s, pre-1950s, is that Towles is sold to General Foods Corporation. And so that name starts appearing on the labels in 1927. As you can see, all of these different examples of the cans, they all have General Foods somewhere on the label. Something else that I kind of noticed is that in the illustrations on the cans, we also have shifted to this wavy irregular sign that's tacked to the side of the cabin that, you know, whether it's supposed to look like canvas or a hide, almost always those two coincide. So if you have a can out in the wild that has barely any of the lithography left, if you can see, if that label on the side of the can, if you can see any little bit of that waviness, you're pretty safe to assume that that can, as long as it has the rolled seams and seam down the middle, pretty sure that you're looking at a post-1927 can. So in 1940, we start getting some even more creative labeling that wraps around the entire can. Most of them have either a frontier or kind of a callback to the earlier cans. So you get these they feel very 1950s, the blacksmith and the frontier inn, all of these examples that, you know, just these great, you know, images of rabbits and kids absolutely wanting pancakes and wanting syrup. A couple other examples, but I'm going to go back just a couple, because the other things that I wanted to mention is that at this time period, the chimney actually also seems to get a little bigger. So it's a larger external friction cap and an interior metal sealing insert. And there's also kind of a starred date there, as you might expect during wartime. So from 1943 to 1948, the log cabin cans were not produced. And instead, Towles and General Foods Corporation packaged the syrup in glass bottles. There's still a little bit of stylistic things that are reminiscent of the log cabin, but definitely during that time period, they are not. There are no cans from that date. So again, those are the main features that you'd be looking for. And then 1956, that's pretty much the end. That's the end of when the cans were produced. But it's still a very popular syrup. You can still get log cabin syrup. And I think there's a lot of nostalgia about the cans, and even when they were first no longer produced. So there are every so often there's commemorative items that come out. And so in 1971, there was a log cabin shaped bank that was given away as a promotion, very explicitly labeled, this is not a food container, never filled with syrup, but designed exclusively to be a little bank. And I just had a couple other examples of the creative giveaways and advertising that Towles used. This is one of my favorites. There's the little log cabin express, so you could turn your log cabin into a little pull train, which is a lot of fun. So these are the key attributes in the date ranges that I've just gone through, and there's definitely a lot of overlap, but each of these features should be able to help an archaeologist in the field identify generally what time range the can might date to. And when you use it with other can chronologies, like the Simonis milk can chronology or the Hills Brothers coffee chronology, some of these other canned chronologies that are out there, you have a much better chance of really narrowing down what your date range is. And so that's kind of exciting. That's kind of and these are also really common. So especially this date range is fully within the periods of mining and other exploration in the Great Basin. And so a lot of historic sites in Nevada do have these cans. So there's a really good chance that they can be found and used to help date sites. So Towles, along with the regular log cabin syrup, they also had another special can for their wigwam syrup. Similar era. This one was patented in 1921. There's advertisements from 22, 24, but from the research that I've been able to do, it seems that this was not as common of a syrup. But what I have been able to find on like Etsy and eBay and other sites like that are the little individual labeled wigwam syrup, little decanters that would be on a table at a restaurant. So I'm guessing that wigwam syrup was more of a restaurant syrup than have in every household. But this wonderful photo down on the bottom corner shows some of the other figural and shaped cans that Towles put out, including their Target brand table syrup, which is kind of shaped like a canteen, and their bucket syrup, which of course shipped in a bucket. So no commentary, no comments on syrup would be complete without also bringing up Mrs. Butterworth. These bottles are one of the other very more immediately recognizable brands that you might find. Mrs. Butterworth's was shipped and distributed in glass figural bottles between 1961 and 1999. So clearly, some of them are not yet in the historic over 50-year range. But we're getting really close to the end of when the metal caps were used. So the metal caps were used on the bottles until the mid-1980s. So as terrifying as that is for me, that is swiftly approaching that 50-year mark. But that is something that you can kind of tell on the bottle whether it's because the safety band from the plastic caps stays, but it also the neck looks a little bit different. So that's another fun pantry staple that we might find out in archaeological sites in Nevada. So a new addition to this talk is Shed's peanut butter. So we grew up, my family I definitely grew up with Shed's Country Crock, butter, not quite butter, on the table. But for a while between 1968 and the 80s, this company put out 5-gallon, or 5-pound rather, peanut butter cans, and shaped like little pails, with depending on your viewpoint, either adorable or mildly deranged illustrations of animals and elves. But the great thing here is that the metal pail was only manufactured between around 1968 and 1974. So again, if you find a Shed's peanut butter pail out on a site, if you can find any little bit of that label left, then you're looking at a historic site. In 74, they changed to a plastic pail. So I just love their tagline for families who hate to run out of peanut butter, because oh my gosh, 5 pounds at one time. But it's kind of that continuation of advertising that's kind of towards kids, kind of towards families. It's the kind of thing that a kid, if they're shopping with their parents, would be like, I want that one. I want the pail. I want the little house. Um, so it's something that, anytime we think that something is new in advertising, it's really not. It's been going on pretty much the whole time. So one of the ones that another can that I started seeing early in my career that I always was just fascinated with and thought these have to be easily dateable, are baking powder tins. I just, the lids are so distinctive, and problem with baking powder tins, and this is where I'll have to admit that this is where chronology kind of broke down on me. Um, there's this great book called The Baking Powder Wars, the cutthroat food fight that revolutionized cooking. Um, and one of the facts that she relates in the book is that by 1942, there were at least 42 baking powder companies in New York City area alone. So just in New York. So while there are names that we are very familiar with, like Royal and Dr. Price's and Calumet, there are so many variations of of baking powder tins that a chronology for them was something that was a little bit beyond what I could try to fit and try to put together for this talk. But I did want to include them because there's a lot of information, a lot of things about baking powder, that until I had read that book was startling, like literal baking powder wars. So starting around 1876, Royal Baking Powder Company kind of basically started trying to take their competitors completely out of the market. And we're making, as this article from 1885 says, that they're still making enemies among those who are manufacturing and selling impure articles for leavening purposes, and their name is Legion, because there's nothing like the dramatic late 19th century newspaper reporting. But ironically, these wars were also part of the reason why we ended up with the Food and Drug Act in 1906. So we're much more familiar with the influence of the jungle, Upton Sinclair's book, and the wildness of medicines like Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, and other medicines of the time that could contain cocaine and alcohol and various other substances that, of course, they would make you feel better for a little bit. But ironically enough, these baking powder wars was also one of the reasons why that act was passed. So this is 1874 newspaper. So I'm sorry, yes, 1870, 75, thereabouts. That Royal baking powder, Dr. Price's cream baking powder adulterated, a challenge, a further fraud, which was answered several days later. Dr. Price's cream baking powder is not adulterated, a challenge, exposure of a further fraud, which just feels a lot like, very, very much like, I'm rubber, you're glue, whatever bounces off of me sticks to you, kind of advertising. But this is kind of the Wild West of late 19th century food advertising. One of the other things that Royal Baking Powder did, and all of the baking powder companies did, was put out specialty cookbooks. And this is my favorite because depending on your perspective, it's either charming or pure nightmare fuel. These illustrations are just kind of incredible. The cookbooks would include, this one is geared towards, clearly more towards children and has a story, but also includes recipes of how to include royal baking powder in your cooking. But yeah, the illustrations are pretty wild, but it is one of my favorite time periods for advertising. So I wanted to include that here, just because, wow, it's impressively wild. But looking at the cans, some things that I can tell you about chronology for these tins is that baking powder, while it was originally sold bulk at a grocer's, from about the 1850s onward, it was sold individually in cans. And this was a huge transition for a lot of foods, where things were becoming and being designed to be a little bit more shelf stable, designed to be sold individually and not bulk. But you also have, again, the advertising images, which are not always a one-to-one, because one thing to remember with this is that once these newspapers got the block advertising, they may continue to use it for multiple years after. But I've found pretty good luck building these chronologies with trying to find kind of the earliest iteration of certain images and giving that date as kind of a potential earliest potential date, give or take a few years. But what we also know is that those embossed lids that I liked so much were pretty common until the 1930s. And as you see in a lot of food through the time, you have absolutely pure comes up a lot. Again, that's that time between before 1906, when there was a lot of accusations of impurities in the food, but there was also a lot of actual occasions of our food not necessarily being what it was advertised as. So the last major set of cans that I'm going to talk about today is MJB coffee. And MJB coffee was started in 1891 in San Francisco by Max James Brandonson, the MJB in MJB coffee. And they were famous for their early Y advertising. So this included everything from murals on the side of buildings, as you can see on the actual cut cans themselves, and this wonderful little coffee parlor with this this coffee cup that is lit up with the why question. Also, it would be great to have coffee at 38 cents a pound at this point. So jumping right in, from 1891 to 1905, I have absolutely no clue what the labels looks like. I couldn't find anything in the papers, couldn't find any confirmed examples online, but because I don't want to not share anything, it was probably green. That's about the only thing, is that the label was probably green. It was probably paper and probably had green on it. But so as a consolation prize, here is this wonderful stereograph of this little girl, I think, trying to keep her dog from eating the bacon. Seems a pretty common, very relatable. But in 1905, already MJB was using a lithographed label. MJB was in a solid banner. The phrase "whole roast" was right under the banner, sometimes, not always. Interestingly, this is where the very subtle changes to the label happen. So here, there's a capital C on coffee, and the phrase MJ Brandonson and Company, San Francisco, California, is on the can. And here's an example of one of the next cans from 1914 to 1917. Again, you've got capital C, you've got the MJB in a banner, but it's solid now. Again, whole roast is sometimes on there. These cans actually had a solder dot on the bottom of the can and an external friction lid, which, not sure about these earlier cans, exactly what kind of lid. I'm assuming an external friction lid, but again, I couldn't find examples with that label. But you can see some of the smaller shifts, and the top of the can in the advertisement from 1914 has the MJB Coffee Y advertising still. In 1917, you start seeing vacuum packed on the cans. And this is an example from the Reno Evening Gazette. They also started selling a 5-pound can size, which was more of a pail, which again, as a young archaeologist, I always assumed that anything that was in a pail was lard. But as I've gained more experience and seen more things, there were a lot of foods and pantry stuffs that were sold in pails. And coffee from MJB is one of them. So again, you had a solder dot on the bottom of the can. The company name and location was still there, and you still have a capital C in coffee. You have vacuum packed, kind of continues to be the way that they're advertising the coffee. So you see vacuum packed on the can a little bit more. Again, it's a lithograph label. It's an external friction lid. But there are still subtle changes. The biggest one here is that the company name and San Francisco is no longer on the front of the can. In 1921, they introduced a pry-off multi-friction lid, so similar to like a paint can lid. And so you've got the new instructions of pry off, don't cut this, it keeps the contents of the can fresh. So you're seeing, again, subtle changes in the label. But there's also, ironically, in this time period, they seem to be using both lid styles. So it's a little squishy in here. I haven't figured out when that transition happened. But the labels, if there is any amount on a can that you find in the field, if there's any amount of the label, that's for this time period, that's what you're going to be looking for. The MJB separated by the dots, the capital C in the coffee, vacuum packed, the solid banner, and of course that green color, which doesn't entirely last. So from 1926 to 1929, you get subtle changes. The biggest one of which is that MJB is no longer in a banner. It has the circle, the kind of the oval around it, or a line. And you can start to see that their advertising is shifting a little bit more. It's becoming a little bit more, taking up more real estate in the newspapers, and kind of becoming a lot more national. And so in 1929, the main switch is they are now using a key strip opened can. And so you can see both in the illustration and in the example that I have here, that what we commonly see in the 20s and 30s of this type of can opening, MJB had used it as well. But again, not a lot of changes to the label. It's just mostly the can opening. But again, you can kind of see how the advertising is tracking. So this is a little bit early, but examples of the can don't really start seeing it very consistently until like 29. So in 32, they introduce this safety seal that shows up in advertising, and I've seen a few examples. So it shows both on the side of the can and the bottom of the can where you have that solder dot. But again, it's a key strip open can rather than a strictly external friction. So like these are subtle changes, and they're fast. If you notice the difference between the log cabin cans where things would be steady for 10 years, 20 years, MJB was changing it up. I think like a lot of other coffee brands were, every couple years, I think just trying to get more market share, trying to be the next new exciting thing. So from 34 to 42, you lose any line or banner around MJB. You still have the capital C in coffee, but now you get this little emblem of Quality Coffee of America and the United States. But there's a slight shift, even though there's still that capital C in coffee. If you look look at it, there's a shift in the font used, and it starts leaning more to the right as opposed to the left, which is kind of a, it's, I think they're going for the kind of that more modern clean look. So from 42 to 61, very similar to log cabin syrup, where you don't have cans for a couple years. The coffee changes to a lowercase c. You end up with the small oval with the type of coffee. So whether it's fine ground, regular ground, drip or silex. They're still key opened cans, but there's no longer a solder dot on the bottom. And these are like also they feel a little bit smaller, sizes on the cans as well. And this is the can that we found in the field a couple years back that sent me on this journey of trying to figure out how old a particular MJB coffee can is. And as you can see, there's still a little bit of a label, but these attributes that we've noticed, that lowercase c, that coffee, tilting a little bit to the right, the oval with the type of coffee it is, and not as much ornamentation around MJB. 61 to 64, there's no line, and they drop the dots between MJB. So that even though the cans look fairly similar, that's the attribute that changes. So that's, the difference between, are you looking at, a 40s or 50s can or solidly a 60s can? Can be very important on when recording a site. So from 64 to 67, you start getting what reminds me of the coffee cans that I saw my parents using when I was a kid. So they're opened with a can opener. They're the taller cans with the ribs. But the label is pretty similar. I just kind of love that, being able to find the exact new can open with can opener in both the advertising and the can itself, which is kind of nice. From the 67 to the 70s, they've clearly gone through a new rebranding. And you have kind of this rounded diamond, and the branding becomes really consistent between the ground and instant coffee types, where that hadn't been the case before. And this is where you have either a can opener or a pull-off seal with the plastic lid to put back on the can, or in the case of the instant coffee, which was in the jars, a jar lid. So this list of attributes is a lot longer than the one that it is for log cabin cans, and there's a lot more overlap. But these are the things that you're most looking for MJB coffee. Is does it have on the front of the can that it was in San Francisco, that it's MJ Brandonstein and Company? What does the MJB look like? Does it have dots? Does it not have dots? Is it in a banner? Is it by itself? What does the word coffee look like? Is it in script? Is it in an elaborate script? Is the C capitalized or not? And then, of course, the openings are really, really crucial for understanding the dates on these. So, whether it has a pry-off lid, an external friction lid, a key strip opening, if the United States is on the can, just all of these little subtle changes that kind of really kind of went fast and really altered what the cans look like through time. But that's about all I've got. And if you're like me, it's getting a little into the evening and I kind of want coffee and pancakes now. But I would be happy to answer any questions, hear any comments, anything else you'd like to go back and see again.
Feel free to put your comments and anything into the chat if you have any questions or comments.
Oh, no questions, no comments.
Oh, there we go.
But this definitely, kind of like I said before at the beginning, is when you're a field archaeologist and you're looking at these can scatters, you're always looking for what's the thing that's going to give me the most reliable date, what's the thing that's going to give me the fastest date. And now that I'm hoping to kind of build our library of chronologies that we can use to kind of help everybody out.
That's pretty cool. So Stephen said, have you done a price comparison on coffee? Because I know he knows the price. Some prices were on the labels.
Yeah, I haven't done that specifically. Um, I did notice when I was putting together, interestingly enough, I did notice for the Shed's peanut butter pail that it was like $1.79 for the pail for like the first 10 years, and then all of a sudden, like around 71, 72, it just jumps to like $2, and then there's a lot more coupons offered. Um, but yeah, the coffee, I noticed that it was changing, so but I didn't track it, and I also didn't track how it compared to other brands. Um, but they're definitely, so you've got single pound 40 cents, 3 pounds for $1 in 1906, which is definitely not what coffee costs now. But no, I didn't formally track it, because it's one of those things that's we so rarely get the lithography left on the labels when we see these cans in the field. And so I was trying to find like what's the bigger features on the can that we might be able to see. Um, and I think just, as it is now, prices change, and so it's often not printed on the can itself. Because the whole point of these types of things is that they're more shelf stable. And so I think stores would want the flexibility to be able to change the prices as needed. That might change more and faster than the cans themselves change, although these change pretty quick. But yeah, things definitely jump. There's a couple big jumps in the 70s, and then again in the 80s, and as we see today, continuing.
So, okay, I'm going to try to pronounce this correctly. Is it panache syrup? He said, what's that? And it was on the earlier syrup labels, perhaps
Yeah,
brand name.
I think it's that. I'm actually not entirely sure. Let me bounce back to the beginning. I think it's on. Oop. Let's go back here.
Oh, there.
Yep. I'm not actually sure how it's pronounced. But I think based on the fact that they advertise either Pinoche or Pinoc, maybe, and then cabin camp syrup or maple syrup, I think it has to do with the mix between the maple syrup and sugar. As you go through time, you start seeing on the labels, the early cans, it's maple syrup, just plain maple syrup. And then you have cane and maple syrup. Um, cane sugar and maple sugar syrup. So I think in those early brands, in those early varieties, I think it has a lot to do with the proportion of maple syrup. I could be wrong, but that's just my guess. Because it does shift, and then the more as we get farther in time, the proportion of maple syrup drops dramatically. So even by the 20s, 30s, and 50s, we're looking at 85% cane and only 15% maple sugar syrups.
They're also they're also ordering a fancy syrup.
Again, I think it's some combination of the proportion of what actually goes into the syrup and the advertising. Just like the baking powders, all of them we are absolutely pure. I think you see also in this can here, absolutely pure and fancy. I think it's, again, another way to be able to charge more. At least that's my guess. I haven't seen anything in the documentations for sure. But there's definitely a lot of folks that have done a lot more research into the making of the maple syrup and the companies themselves than I have. I tried to limit my buffet of things to just the things that I might be able to see as an archaeologist that would help me date the sites that I find.
Okay. Have you looked at the consistency of 5-pound serving containers? Was that a common amount to sell previous to the war rationing?
I don't know. I was actually kind of surprised by seeing these 5-pound. I'm so used to, from an archaeological context, seeing things in, 12 ounce, 1 pound, 2 pound. So seeing, 5-pound cans of anything was a little surprising to me. And then it's like a lot of things, the first time you see it, and then you see it everywhere. So same, I hadn't really noticed the handle on the side, and then within 6 months we'd found 2 of them on the same project. So it's kind of the way the universe works. But I don't know, if I don't know how, in terms of the actual manufacturing process, if it was more efficient, if there was more of a market for it. I don't know what conditions would have the companies do 5-pound products, or whether there was consistency among those 5 pounds.
Okay. Do we have any other questions for Sarah? No.
Well, before I go, I did want to call out a guy by the name of Matt Thomas. He has this great website. He has done extensive research and continues to do a lot of research about maple syrup. And he was crucial and very generous in sending me a lot of the photos that I was able to present today, and commentary to kind of help develop and help check the log cabin chronology. So I don't want to leave him out in my thank yous. And then of course to my colleagues at Broadbent for showing me all of the field photos and kind of supporting this wild hair that I'd had, and also thanks to Nevada's for Cultural Preservation and Site Stewards and Samantha for inviting me today. And I've enjoyed giving you guys a glimpse on the wild world of advertising, chronology, and can types.
I think it's great. We haven't had to talk like this before, because we don't tend to have, one field archaeologist, but also like people don't stop to think about what it takes for us to identify like the actual dates of a historic site. And so this was a really great example of kind of what we have to do in order to be able to do that, and how you have to think about it. And sometimes you don't even start thinking about it until you're standing at a site going, okay, what can I use to figure out how old this is?
And what do I need to record versus because you absolutely don't want to measure every can for
No.
practical and mental health reasons. But like I was saying, the more chronologies that we have, the more chances there are that you'll have sufficient overlapping chronologies so that you can go from saying, well, this is early 20th century to, yeah, this is 1910 to 1917.
Yeah. So this was wonderful. It was a great presentation. Thank you
Thank you.
so much for that.
Oh, you're very welcome.